The telegram arrived at the Kremlin on September 8, 1941, and the officer who delivered it to Joseph Stalin understood that the information would provoke a reaction that might endanger anyone nearby. German forces had closed the ring around Leningrad, the city of 3 million people, birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution, second city of the Soviet Union, was now completely surrounded. The last land route connecting Leningrad to the rest of the Soviet Union, the narrow corridor south of Lake Ladoga, had been severed by German advance. What remained was a city under siege, isolated except for water routes across the lake that would freeze within weeks. Stalin read the telegram in the presence of Vyacheslav Molotov and Georgy Malenkov, his expression transforming from the controlled neutrality he typically maintained to fury that manifested in silence more threatening than shouting. Leningrad was not supposed to fall. The city had been named for Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state. Its loss would be political catastrophe and strategic disaster. The industrial capacity, the symbolic importance, the population, all were now trapped in a siege that German forces were clearly prepared to sustain indefinitely. The military situation that had led to Leningrad's encirclement was the culmination of failures that Stalin recognized as partly his own responsibility. The initial German invasion in June had caught Soviet forces unprepared, despite warnings Stalin had dismissed as provocations or British disinformation. The subsequent retreat had been disorganized, with entire armies destroyed in encirclements that might have been avoided with earlier authorization for withdrawal. Leningrad's situation was consequence of strategic decisions made in Moscow, defensive failures at the front, and German operational skill that had consistently outmaneuvered Soviet responses. Marshal Kliment Voroshilov commanded the Leningrad front, and his reports through July and August had detailed the developing crisis with increasing urgency. German forces were advancing from multiple directions: Army Group North from the west and southwest, Finnish forces from the north and northwest. Soviet counterattacks had failed to halt the advances. Defensive lines had been penetrated or outflanked. The city's outer defenses were being overrun, and the corridor connecting Leningrad to the rest of Soviet territory was narrowing daily. Stalin had responded to Voroshilov's reports with demands for more aggressive defense, for counterattacks that would drive German forces back, for holding positions regardless of cost. The orders reflected Stalin's refusal to accept that Leningrad might be lost, and his belief that sufficient determination could overcome material and tactical disadvantages. But determination had not prevented the encirclement. German forces had achieved what Voroshilov's reports had warned was becoming inevitable, and now Stalin confronted a situation where his orders to hold the city could be followed only by a garrison that was surrounded and cut off from reinforcement or supply. Major Dmitry Volkov commanded an NKVD security battalion within Leningrad, and he experienced the encirclement not as strategic development, but as transformation of his mission from defending the city to defending a city that was now a prison. The civilian population that had been evacuating throughout August was now trapped. Those who remained would share the garrison's fate. The food supplies that had seemed adequate for weeks would need to feed 3 million people for months, perhaps longer. The ammunition and fuel stocks were finite, and there was no longer any prospect of replenishment, except by the precarious water route across Lake Ladoga. Stalin summoned his military advisors to assess options that ranged from bad to catastrophic. General Georgy Zhukov, recently appointed to command reserve armies, was ordered to Leningrad to organize the defense and, if possible, break the encirclement. The assignment was characteristically impossible. Zhukov was given authority but limited resources, ordered to achieve breakthrough while simultaneously defending Moscow, which German forces were also approaching. Stalin's instructions were clear: Leningrad must not fall. How this was to be accomplished with forces that had already failed to prevent encirclement was Zhukov's problem to solve. The political implications of Leningrad's siege extended beyond military considerations. The city was showcase of Soviet achievement, symbol of revolutionary triumph, center of Bolshevik tradition. Its fall would damage Soviet prestige internationally and undermine morale domestically. Stalin had purged the Leningrad Party leadership in the late 1930s, eliminating potential rivals who might have used the city's prominence as base for challenging his authority. Now those purges meant Leningrad's current leadership was personally loyal to Stalin but less experienced, less capable of independent action, less equipped to manage a crisis of this magnitude. Andrei Zhdanov, the party secretary in Leningrad, received instructions from Stalin that emphasized political control as much as military defense. The civilian population must be organized for total resistance. Food must be rationed strictly. Any defeatism must be eliminated ruthlessly. The city would be defended block by block, building by building if necessary. Surrender was not an option that would be considered or permitted. The orders were clear, but the resources to implement them were limited by the encirclement that had cut Leningrad off from the state apparatus that normally sustained Soviet authority. The immediate crisis was food. Leningrad had not been stockpiled for siege. Soviet planning had assumed either the city would be defended successfully or it would be evacuated. Neither had occurred. Instead, 3 million people were trapped in a city with perhaps 2 months of food at peacetime consumption rates. Rationing would extend that, but even severe rationing could not sustain the population indefinitely. The only supply route was across Lake Ladoga, using ships that were vulnerable to German air attack and artillery fire. When winter came and the lake froze, supplies would need to travel across ice roads that would be equally vulnerable and weather-dependent. Zhukov participated in the organization of Leningrad's internal defense, establishing checkpoints and security posts, identifying buildings that could serve as strong points, preparing for street fighting if German forces entered the city. His NKVD battalion's mission included not just military defense, but political control, monitoring civilian morale, suppressing any defeatist sentiment, ensuring that party authority was maintained even as conditions deteriorated. The dual mission reflected Soviet reality. The defense of Leningrad was simultaneously military operation and political test of the population's loyalty to Stalin and the Soviet state. German intentions toward Leningrad became clear through September as Army Group North settled into siege positions rather than launching assault to capture the city. Hitler had decided that Leningrad would be starved into surrender rather than taken by costly urban combat. German artillery would bombard the city. German aircraft would strike at targets of opportunity. But the Wehrmacht would not commit infantry to fighting through Leningrad's streets. The siege would be a war of attrition where time favored the besiegers and each day brought the surrounded population closer to starvation. Stalin's response to the encirclement evolved over September from demands for immediate counteroffensive to recognition that Leningrad would endure prolonged siege. Zhukov organized limited attacks that achieved local successes without breaking the encirclement. The Leningrad front stabilized defensive lines that prevented German forces from directly assaulting the city. And across Lake Ladoga, the improvised supply route began operating despite losses to German interdiction. The city would not be relieved quickly, but it might survive long enough for strategic situation to change. The human cost of the siege began accumulating immediately. German artillery struck civilian areas, killing hundreds in the first weeks. Luftwaffe bombers attacked food warehouses, destroying supplies that could not be replaced. But the greater threat was hunger. By October, rations had been reduced to levels that provided insufficient calories for survival. The civilian population began to starve, slowly at first, but with increasing speed as winter approached and food stocks dwindled, the deaths would eventually number in hundreds of thousands, a toll that exceeded combat casualties and made the siege of Leningrad one of history's deadliest urban disasters. Stalin monitored the situation from Moscow, receiving reports from Zhukov about conditions in the city and from Zhukov about military operations around the perimeter. The reports detailed deteriorating circumstances that would have prompted evacuation or surrender in any conventional military assessment. But Soviet ideology did not permit conventional assessments. Leningrad would be held because Stalin had ordered it held, because the city's fall would be unacceptable loss, because the political cost of surrender exceeded the human cost of resistance, regardless of how high that human cost climbed. Zhukov experienced the siege's first winter as descent into conditions that exceeded anything his training had prepared him for. His battalion's strength declined not primarily from combat casualties, but from starvation and disease. Soldiers who were supposed to man defensive positions lacked the energy to stand guard for full shifts. The equipment that should have been maintained deteriorated because maintenance required calories that were no longer available. The security mission that was supposed to control the civilian population became irrelevant, as civilians focused entirely on survival rather than on anything NKVD might consider subversive. The ice road across Lake Ladoga opened in late November, when the lake froze solid enough to support truck traffic. The route was immediately christened the Road of Life, the only supply line that kept Leningrad from complete starvation. Trucks drove across the ice under German artillery fire and air attack, carrying food into the city and evacuating selected civilians and critical personnel. The tonnage was never sufficient. The road could deliver perhaps a third of what Leningrad needed to sustain its population. But a third was better than nothing, and the ice roads operation demonstrated that Leningrad had not been completely abandoned, that the Soviet state was attempting to sustain the city, even if those attempts were inadequate. Stalin's personal involvement in Leningrad's siege remained constant through late 1941 and into 1942. He reviewed reports from the city, questioned military commanders about operations to relieve the siege, allocated resources from reserves that were desperately needed elsewhere. The attention reflected both Leningrad's political importance and Stalin's recognition that the siege represented failure of Soviet defensive strategy that he had shaped. The city was surrounded because German forces had advanced hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory, because Soviet armies had been defeated or destroyed, because the military leadership Stalin had purged in the late 1930s was being replaced by commanders learning through catastrophic defeat. By December 1941, the pattern of the siege was established. Leningrad would remain surrounded, supplied inadequately across Lake Ladoga, subjected to German artillery and air attack, defended by military forces and civilian population that were slowly starving. The siege would continue not for weeks, but for months, eventually extending to nearly 900 days of encirclement that would become one of the war's defining ordeals. Stalin had learned Leningrad was surrounded in September. But the full implications of that encirclement, the death toll, the suffering, the duration, would emerge only gradually as the siege became a grinding test of endurance that exceeded normal bounds of human experience. The decision to hold Leningrad regardless of cost was Stalin's, made in September when encirclement was complete and alternative courses might still have been possible. Evacuation might have saved most of the civilian population, though it would have required abandoning the city to German occupation. Surrender might have prevented the worst starvation, though it was never seriously considered, because Stalin did not permit surrender. The choice to defend Leningrad, through siege of indefinite duration, was a strategic decision that prioritized political and symbolic considerations over humanitarian concerns, that accepted catastrophic civilian casualties as price for denying the city to German occupation. Zhukov survived the siege's first winter, one of a minority of military personnel who did not succumb to starvation, disease, or German fire. His experience of September 1941, when the encirclement was completed and the siege's true nature became apparent, was of recognition that the war he had expected to fight had been replaced by something different and more terrible. The defense of Leningrad would not be brief heroic resistance followed by relief or defeat. It would be prolonged suffering, where the enemy was as much hunger and cold as German forces, where survival itself became the victory being pursued. When Stalin learned Leningrad was surrounded, he confronted military failure that was partly consequence of his own decisions. The purges that had decimated military leadership, the refusal to authorize timely withdrawals, the dismissal of warnings about German invasion. His response was characteristic: orders to hold regardless of cost, demands for counteroffensives with inadequate resources, allocation of responsibility for failure to commanders, rather than to the strategic decisions that had created the conditions for failure. Leningrad would be held because Stalin ordered it held, and the fact that holding the city would kill hundreds of thousands through starvation was subordinate to the political imperative that the city not fall to German occupation. The siege that began with the encirclement Stalin learned of in September 1941 would continue until January 1944, when Soviet offensives finally broke the German ring. The 872 days of siege would kill over 1 million people, most of them civilians who starved to death in the war's longest and most lethal urban siege. The decision to defend Leningrad through that siege, made by Stalin when he learned the city was surrounded, represented strategic choice that prioritized political symbolism over human life, that accepted mass death as preferable to territorial loss, that transformed Leningrad into monument both to Soviet resistance and to the costs Stalin was willing to impose in pursuit of objectives he deemed essential, regardless of human price.